Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? Tonight, we open 4 most horrifying dimensions in cosmic horror, a title that sounds like classification but hides a deeper problem. Cosmic horror has never been satisfied with monsters alone. Its most lasting threat is structural. It asks what happens when reality itself is only one arrangement among many. Writers in the early 20th century sensed this shift as astronomy expanded. Geometry broke its limits, and human meaning quietly lost its center. Horror followed the math. These dimensions are not distant places reached by travel. They are conditions that expose how narrow human perception really is. Each one represents a different failure point, space that refuses to behave, time that no longer flows forward, thought that becomes a location, an existence that continues without observers. Consider this carefully. The fear does not come from what lives there, but from the fact that these systems function perfectly without us. I am not offering revelations or hidden maps. What follows is a guided reading across literature, philosophy, and cultural memory, tracing how these dimensions were imagined, why they persist, and what they quietly suggest about our place in the universe. We must pause here, because listening already places you inside the question. By staying, you accept the possibility that reality is stable only by habit. With that in mind, we can begin where these dimensions first appeared, on the page, before they learned how to follow us. The idea of hostile dimensions did not appear suddenly. It emerged between 1890 and 1935, during a period when science quietly dismantled familiar assumptions. Darwin displaced human centrality in biology. Einstein unsettled time and space in 1905 and 1915. At the same time, mathematicians explored non-Euclidean geometry, proving that space did not require human intuition to function. Writers absorbed these shocks, indirectly. Lovecraft, Machen, and later Clark Ashton Smith did not treat dimensions as speculative scenery. They treated them as consequences. Reality, once assumed stable, became provisional. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror begins when explanation survives belief, and knowledge continues even after comfort collapses. Earlier traditions offered other worlds, but rarely hostile ones. Medieval cosmology arranged reality vertically, with moral order built into structure. Dante's realms reward, punish, and instruct. By contrast, 19th century philosophy removed intention from the universe. Kant's noumenon defined reality as fundamentally inaccessible, while Schopenhauer reduced meaning to blind process. Compare this with Plato's cave. Plato promised release through reason. Cosmic horror removes that promise. The problem is not ignorance, but exposure. We must pause here. What happens when clearer perception brings less understanding rather than more? This shift explains why dimensions in cosmic horror lack guidance, hierarchy, or purpose recognizable to human thought. Language struggled to follow these changes. The word dimension began as a mathematical term describing measurable degrees of freedom. By the late 1800s, it migrated into metaphysics and fiction. Writers borrowed technical language without its safeguards. They spoke of angles that should not exist, colors without wavelength, spaces that folded inward. These were not poetic flourishes. They were admissions of linguistic failure. Description relied on negation because positive terms misled. Not because authors sought mystery, but because available language could not survive the subject. When writers say indescribable, they are not withholding detail. They are signaling structural limits in representation itself. To stabilize these ideas, authors framed them through false scholarship. Lovecraft's invented citations, dates, and translators created a sense of inherited knowledge. Texts like the Necronomicon function as anchors, supposedly cataloging what no catalog could hold. This technique resembles religious commentary traditions more than fiction. Compare medieval glosses on Aristotle, where authority accumulated through repetition rather than proof. Here, repetition suggests reality, not certainty. The illusion of documentation reassures the reader while quietly undermining trust in records. Not a trick, but a strategy. Authority is invoked only to demonstrate its eventual collapse when confronted with dimensions that resist systemization. Historical examples reinforce this pattern. The great god Pan, 1894, framed horror as perceptual expansion. The House on the Borderland, 1908, treated time as a collapsing coordinate. Lovecraft later unified these approaches without formal explanation. His letters from the 1920s show deliberate restraint. He avoided full exposition because clarity would falsify the effect. Consider this carefully. Cosmic. Dimensions are terrifying, not because they are unknown, but because partial understanding is enough to destabilize reason. The reader receives fragments, observations, testimonies, equations. Together, they suggest coherence, but never deliver it. Psychologically, these dimensions redefined madness. Insanity no longer marked error or weakness. It marked incompatibility. Minds fail because perception exceeds biological design limits. Cultists appear stable because they adapt through reduction, not expansion. This is not possession, but accommodation. The horror lies in adjustment, not fear, but function. When a character survives by misreading reality, the story suggests that sanity may depend on ignorance. This reframes knowledge itself as hazardous. What ethical responsibility follows from discovering truths that cannot be shared without damage? These foundations prepare the next step. Once dimensions exist as conceptual threats rather than locations, attention shifts from origin to operation. How do these systems behave? What laws replace human expectation? And why do they continue whether observed or not? To answer this, we must move from history to structure, and from influence to internal logic. Long before cosmic horror named its dimensions, older cultures struggled with the same problem under different terms. Ancient cosmologies assumed a layered universe, but those layers served explanation rather than threat. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, multiple realms coexist, ordered by moral consequence and karmic logic. Medieval Christianity preserved this structure through heaven, earth, and hell. These systems reassured because movement between layers followed rules. What mattered was placement. Cosmic horror inherits the idea of multiple realities, but removes the guarantee that they mean anything. The result is not spiritual vertigo, but ontological drift, existence without orientation. Greek philosophy offers a critical pivot. Plato's cave describes limited perception, yet promises correction through reason. Aristotle reinforces stability by tying form to purpose. By contrast, later philosophy dismantled purpose itself. Kant's critique of pure reason in 1781 formalized a boundary. The noumenal world exists, but cannot be known directly. This was not horror, it was discipline. Yet fiction later treated this limit as an invitation rather than a warning. Consider this carefully. What happens when writers imagine contact with what philosophy insists must remain unreachable? Cosmic dimensions emerge precisely at that point of violation. 19th century thought intensified this shift. Schopenhauer reduced reality to blind will. Nietzsche dissolved objective meaning altogether by the 1880s. At the same time, physics began to undermine common sense. Non-Euclidean geometry proved that space could obey internally consistent rules while contradicting intuition. These ideas circulated beyond academia. Popular science lectures, essays, and speculative fiction translated abstraction into narrative. Dimensions no longer needed theology. They needed only consistency, not divine punishment, but indifference. This distinction matters. Horror no longer depends on moral transgression, but on structural mismatch between human cognition and external systems. Eastern philosophy also plays an indirect role, though often misunderstood. Concepts like Maya or dream reality cycles describe worlds as contingent and unstable. However, these traditions frame instability as a path toward insight or release. Cosmic horror removes that endpoint. Dreams persist without awakening. Layers exist without hierarchy. Compare this to Taoist paradox, which uses contradiction to dissolve rigid thought. Cosmic horror uses contradiction to reveal permanence of uncertainty. The reader is not invited to transcend illusion. They are shown that illusion may be the only usable interface with reality. Language again signals the shift. Earlier myths personified other realms to make them negotiable. Gods could be pleaded with. Spirits could be appeased. Cosmic dimensions reject personification. When beings appear, they function as symptoms rather than agents. The system comes first. Entities follow. This inversion marks a decisive break from mythic tradition. A triad emerges repeatedly: space without center, time without direction, causality without intention. Each element removes a stabilizing assumption inherited from earlier worldviews. Together, they form a universe that operates flawlessly while remaining conceptually inaccessible. Modern psychology absorbed these ideas differently. Freud's unconscious introduced a hidden dimension within the mind. Jung extended this into collective structures, yet both retained therapeutic goals. Knowledge healed. Cosmic horror adopts the metaphor but reverses the outcome. Insight fragments identity. Exposure damages continuity. Madness becomes a rational response to incompatible information. Not illness, but adaptation, failure. This reveals something profound. The most frightening dimensions are not external at all, but those that emerge when familiar explanatory systems are stripped away. By the early 20th century, writers inherited a landscape already prepared for cosmic dimensions. Philosophy had denied access. Science had destabilized structure. Myth had lost authority. What remained was speculation under constraint. These antecedents do not explain the dimensions fully, but they make them inevitable. With this groundwork in place, attention turns from inherited ideas to the language used to express them, and why that language consistently breaks under pressure. The word dimension carried no fear when it first appeared. In mathematics, it described measurable directions, nothing more. Length was one. Width added another. Depth followed. By the mid-19th century, mathematicians such as Riemann expanded the concept beyond physical intuition, especially after 1854, when geometry proved that space could curve without reference to perception. Fiction later borrowed this language, but removed its safeguards. A dimension no longer required measurement. It required only difference. This shift matters because it transformed a neutral term into a threat. A dimension became not a place to map, but a condition that could not be stabilized by human senses. Writers faced an immediate problem. Ordinary language assumes shared experience. Cosmic dimensions break that assumption. As a result, description relied on failure. Authors spoke of angles that hurt to see, colors that defied spectrum, distances that collapsed inward. These were not decorative phrases. They were technical admissions that vocabulary had reached its limit. When Lovecraft wrote of unnameable shapes in the 1920s, he was not refusing detail. He was demonstrating that reference itself collapses when categories no longer apply. This reveals something profound. The horror does not live in what is described, but in the breakdown of description as a reliable tool. Negation became the dominant strategy. Writers defined these dimensions by what they were not solid, not empty, not timeless, not temporal. This is not evasiveness, but method. Positive language implies familiarity. Negation preserves distance. Consider this carefully. By telling readers only what cannot be true, authors prevent the imagination from settling. The mind searches for anchors and finds none. This technique mirrors apophatic theology, where God is defined through absence. Yet the outcome differs. Theology promises meaning beyond language. Cosmic horror offers only continuation beyond understanding. Symbolic patterns replaced concrete detail. Certain images recur with precision. Geometry appears first because it implies rule without comfort. Color follows, especially hues outside known ranges. Finally, sound and rhythm intrude, often described as patterns rather than melodies. This triad, form, perception, vibration, suggests structure without translation. Each element signals order, yet none offer access. These symbols matter because they imply that the dimensions are not chaotic. They are consistent systems that simply exclude human interpretation. Horror arises not from disorder, but from being unnecessary to the system's function. Cartography metaphors reinforce this exclusion. Characters sketch maps that fail, calculate trajectories that loop, and chart regions that rearrange themselves. The problem is not error, it is scale mismatch. Human tools assume stable reference points. Cosmic dimensions lack those anchors. Compare this to early modern exploration narratives, where blank spaces promised eventual knowledge. Here, blankness persists despite observation, not because nothing is there, but because presence does not equal legibility. The map does not reveal ignorance, it reveals the limits of mapping itself. Invented texts intensify the effect. Grimoires, academic papers, and fragmented notes appear authoritative because they imitate real scholarship. Dates, languages, and translators are carefully listed. This creates confidence before dismantling it. The reader trusts the format even as the content resists coherence. The technique mirrors real historical transmission errors, where meaning erodes through copying and commentary. In cosmic horror, erosion is the point. Knowledge decays not over centuries, but instantly upon contact. Records survive, but understanding does not. By the time these linguistic systems solidify, the dimensions no longer require direct depiction. They exist through implication alone. Language becomes evidence of absence rather than presence. This prepares the next shift. Once words fail, attention turns to narrative authenticity, how stories convince us these dimensions exist at all, despite never being fully shown. Cosmic horror relies on a careful illusion, the sense that its dimensions were discovered rather than invented. This effect depends on narrative authenticity, a method refined in the early 20th century. Authors did not present themselves as creators. They posed as editors, translators, or reluctant witnesses. Lovecraft's stories from 1917 to 1937 frequently defer authority to lost manuscripts, unnamed scholars, or incomplete testimonies. The story does not assert truth, it cites it. This framing shifts the reader's role from audience to evaluator. We are not asked to believe, only to consider the possibility that someone else already has. Fragmentation is essential to this process. Accounts arrive damaged, missing pages, corrupted diagrams, unreliable narrators. These gaps are not flaws, they are structural. A complete record would suggest mastery. Fragmentation suggests survival under constraint. Consider this carefully. Why do these stories rarely present a full journey into another dimension? Because completeness would imply comprehension. Instead, we receive edges and aftermaths. The dimension is inferred through consequence. Crops fail, mines fracture, geometry warps. The cause remains partially hidden, which preserves plausibility by refusing closure. Scholarly imitation deepens the effect. Footnotes, citations, and cross-references appear with precision. Titles are repeated across stories as if part of a shared archive. This technique resembles real academic discourse, where authority accumulates through reference rather than proof. Compare this to 18th century natural philosophy, which cataloged phenomena before explaining them. Cosmic horror adopts the catalog, but withholds the explanation. The reader recognizes the form and trusts it instinctively. When meaning fails to follow, unease replaces doubt. The structure promises understanding. The content denies it. Consistency across texts further strengthens authenticity. Lovecraft reused names, locations, and conceptual rules without formal systematization. This creates a sense of continuity without confirmation. Readers perceive pattern not because it is explained, but because it recurs. This is not world building in the modern sense. It is implication building, not a closed mythology, but an open archive. The dimensions feel older than any single story because they appear already embedded within a broader, unfinished record. Unreliable narrators play a specific role here. They are not deceptive. They are limited. Many are scientists, scholars, or rational observers whose tools fail under pressure. Their credibility matters. When such figures admit confusion, the reader accepts it as evidence rather than weakness. Madness becomes a narrative filter, distorting testimony without invalidating it. This distinction is crucial. Not insanity as fantasy, but sanity stretched beyond design limits. The narrator does not collapse emotionally. Their framework does. Temporal distance also supports authenticity. Events often occur years before the narration. The story is reconstructed after the fact, through memory and documents. This delay mirrors real historical investigation, where certainty erodes over time. Dates anchor the account, yet resolution remains absent. The reader encounters an unresolved case that resists synthesis. This approach avoids immediacy. Horror emerges slowly through accumulation and absence rather than confrontation. Finally, authenticity depends on restraint. Cosmic dimensions are rarely named directly and never explained fully. Explanation would collapse the illusion by converting suggestion into statement. The stories trust implication more than detail. What is withheld matters as much as what is shown. This reveals something profound. Belief is not produced by certainty, but by coherence under limitation. The dimensions feel real because the narrative behaves as if reality itself is only partially accessible. With this narrative framework established, the groundwork is complete. The dimensions now exist as credible threats within the text. The next step is to examine what these dimensions actually represent once they are allowed to operate, how they function, what principles govern them, and why their internal logic proves more disturbing than any creature within them. Cosmic horror rests on a small set of philosophical pressures that operate together. Insignificance comes first. Humanity is no longer the measure of events, but a local accident. Lovecraft stated in 1927 that the universe is vast and uncaring, a sentence often quoted because it refuses consolation. Entropy follows closely. These dimensions do not move toward climax or resolution. They decay, loop, or persist without improvement. A third element completes the structure: dream reality. Consciousness becomes a medium rather than a viewpoint. Dreams are not symbols. They are access points. This triad, insignificance, entropy, dream reality, defines dimensions that function without. Narrative payoff, denying the reader morale or emotional progression. Within these systems, entities appear, but rarely as individuals. The so-called old ones are not villains. They are constants. Lovecraft described them as not composed altogether of flesh and blood, suggesting incompatibility rather than monstrosity. Some function like natural laws. Others resemble ecosystems. Dreamland's beings, by contrast, occupy transitional roles. They negotiate, mislead, or observe, but do not explain. This distinction matters. The dimension does not serve the entity. The entity serves the dimension's conditions. Not creatures invading reality, but reality briefly revealing its native inhabitants. Fear emerges from scale mismatch rather than threat. Human interaction follows predictable failure patterns. Contact produces fascination before damage. Characters study, document, and attempt translation. Madness arrives later. Importantly, madness does not signify falsehood. It signals overload. In the Call of Cthulhu, scattered witnesses report consistent details despite psychological collapse. This consistency matters more than sanity. Cultists appear functional because they simplify their understanding, not because they understand more. Survival depends on misinterpretation. The horror lies here. Adaptation requires intellectual loss. We must pause here. What does it mean when sanity depends on knowing less, not more? Forbidden knowledge accelerates this collapse. Books, equations, and artifacts operate as gateways because they encode incompatible frameworks. The Necronomicon is dangerous not because it lies, but because it tells the truth without translation. One fictional passage reads, "The mind is a door poorly hinged." The metaphor is precise. Opening occurs before readiness. Knowledge bypasses gradual learning and forces total context change. Libraries become hazardous environments. Archives rot not from age, but from exposure. Information remains intact. Interpretation fails. The danger is not secrecy, but accessibility. These ideas extend beyond literature. Philosophers later echoed similar anxieties. Thomas Nagel asked in 1974 what it is like to be a bat, arguing that some experiences resist human understanding. Cosmic horror answers brutally. Some realities resist all understanding, yet still operate. Compare this to Gnostic traditions, where secret knowledge frees the soul. Here, knowledge traps it. Revelation does not ascend, it dislocates. This inversion explains why dimensions feel hostile even when passive. They do nothing wrong, they simply continue. Quotations across the genre reinforce restraint. Lovecraft wrote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear of the unknown, but his work narrows that claim. Fear arises not from the unknown, but from partial knowing. Full ignorance comforts. Partial clarity destroys. This reveals something profound. Epistemic collapse occurs when explanatory systems remain functional but no longer align with reality. The mind keeps reasoning, but its premises are invalid. Logic persists without relevance. Taken together, these themes redefine horror's center. Threat is secondary. Meaning is primary. Dimensions matter because they expose cognition as local, temporary, and optional. Once this structure is in place, the question shifts again. How do texts dramatize these abstract failures without explaining them away? To answer that, we must examine how specific stories allow these dimensions to intrude, briefly, indirectly, and with lasting consequence. Entities within cosmic dimensions resist the role traditionally assigned to monsters. They do not pursue, deceive, or punish in any human sense. Instead, they persist. Lovecraft's so-called Old Ones illustrate this clearly. In The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, Cthulhu is described as a mountain walked or stumbled, a phrase that removes intent while preserving scale. The being is not hostile. It is indifferent. This distinction is critical. Fear arises because such entities do not recognize humans as participants in events. They are background forces mistaken for agents, much like gravity mistaken for malice when it causes a fall. Many of these beings function less like organisms and more like environmental conditions. Yog-Sothoth, for example, is repeatedly associated with thresholds and intersections. It is described as the gate and the key, suggesting function rather than personality. This reveals something profound. The entity is not within the dimension. It is how the dimension connects. Compare this to mythic gods who rule domains. Here, the entity is the domain's operating principle. It does not act, it allows. The terror lies in accessibility, not aggression. Human contact becomes possible not because the entity chooses it, but because structural alignment briefly occurs. Dreamland's entities complicate this pattern. Unlike the old ones, they communicate. They bargain. They even deceive. Yet their familiarity is misleading. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, 1927, beings appear almost folkloric, but their logic remains alien. They guide without clarity and mislead without malice. Their role is custodial, not instructional. They maintain the dream realm's internal order, not human safety. This creates a dangerous illusion of agency. The reader recognizes faces and dialogue, but meaning remains unstable. Language functions, but reference slips. Understanding feels close, yet never arrives. Later writers expanded these ideas without resolving them. Clark Ashton Smith described entities that exist across time simultaneously, observing decay as a static condition. One fictional line reads, "They did not wait for ruins, they inhabited them eternally." This framing removes eventfulness. Nothing happens because everything has already happened. Such beings do not threaten futures. They negate them. Compare this to traditional apocalyptic figures, which announce endings. Cosmic entities render endings irrelevant. The dimension continues whether events occur or not. Horror emerges from permanence, not catastrophe. Importantly, these entities rarely notice humans at all. When interaction occurs, it is often accidental. A ritual aligns variables. A dream synchronizes with the wrong frequency. An equation removes a safeguard. The being appears as a side effect. This is not summoning. It is exposure. Not an invasion, but a momentary overlap between incompatible systems. Consider this carefully. If contact requires no intention, then avoidance becomes impossible in principle. Safety depends entirely on ignorance and error. precision becomes dangerous. Cult figures within these stories illustrate adaptation rather than devotion. They simplify the entities into symbols they can manage. Names become masks. Rituals become habits. This reduction allows functionality at the cost of accuracy. The cultist survives by misunderstanding correctly. Madness, in this context, is selective alignment. Not loss of reason, but narrowing of perception. Those who seek total comprehension fail first. Those who accept distortion persist longer. This reverses traditional horror logic, where knowledge defeats threat. Across cosmic horror, entities ultimately dissolve into their environments. They cannot be extracted from the dimensions that sustain them. To describe one is to describe a system. To confront one is to encounter structure, not will. This prepares the next problem. If entities are not adversaries and dimensions are not locations, then what exactly happens to the human mind when it tries to interact with such systems? The answer lies in how madness functions, not as breakdown, but as consequence. Human interaction with cosmic dimensions follows a consistent trajectory. Curiosity precedes fear. Characters begin as observers, not victims. Scientists measure, artists dream, scholars translate. Early, contact feels manageable because it produces patterns. Instruments record anomalies. Dreams repeat. Texts align. This stage is crucial. Horror does not arrive through shock, but through confirmation. When multiple sources agree, the mind commits. Lovecraft's protagonists often insist on documentation before panic. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1931, correspondence and phonograph records accumulate slowly. The danger begins when evidence stabilizes. Once a dimension proves consistent, denial becomes impossible, and cognitive strain follows. Madness, in this context, functions differently than in earlier horror traditions. It does not represent emotional collapse or moral weakness. It marks a failure of scale. The human mind evolved to model local environments. Cosmic dimensions exceed those parameters. When perception expands without new cognitive architecture, coherence fractures. Witnesses in the Call of Cthulhu display symptoms not of hysteria, but of overload. Their accounts remain internally consistent. This detail matters. Insanity here does not discredit testimony. It validates it. The mind breaks because it encounters data it cannot compress into usable categories. Crucially, madness arrives after understanding, not before it. Characters grasp enough to destabilize themselves, but not enough to regain equilibrium. Partial knowledge proves more destructive than ignorance. A fictional scholar remarks, "I understood the equation, but not what it replaced." The sentence captures the problem precisely. Old frameworks collapse faster than new ones form. The result is epistemic freefall. Logic persists, but it lacks ground. Reason continues to function while losing relevance. This reveals something profound. Mental breakdown emerges from accurate perception applied to incompatible systems. Cultists occupy an ambiguous position within this pattern. They appear stable, organized, and purposeful. Their survival confuses investigators. The reason becomes clear upon closer examination. Cultists do not seek comprehension. They adopt ritualized behavior that simplifies contact into repeatable action. Chanting replaces analysis. Symbols replace models. This reduction protects them, not because it grants truth, but because it limits exposure. They interact through distortion. Madness becomes selective adaptation rather than total collapse. Those who ask fewer questions endure longer. Dreamers represent another form of interaction. In dream reality dimensions, consciousness functions as location. Prolonged exposure erodes personal identity. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, Randolph Carter navigates with intention, yet gradually loses certainty about origin and selfhood. Memory thins. Desire replaces reason. The danger is not terror, but drift. The dreamer does not break suddenly. They disperse. Identity dissolves into environment. Madness here is not loud. It is quiet attrition. Medical language appears frequently, but fails to explain outcomes. Diagnoses describe symptoms without addressing cause. Physicians note amnesia, fixation, dissociation. None restore stability. Treatment assumes trauma. Cosmic horror presents incompatibility. The problem is not what happened, but what continues to be true. Once a dimension is known, it cannot be unknown. This permanence distinguishes cosmic madness from shock-based insanity. Recovery would require forgetting structure itself. We must pause here. If sanity depends on limited perception, then knowledge carries ethical risk. Characters often attempt silence after exposure, not secrecy, but restraint. They recognize that sharing accurate information guarantees harm. This leads directly to the next problem: forbidden knowledge. Why certain texts, equations, and ideas collapse minds faster than direct encounter, and why access, not intent, defines danger. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is dangerous because it bypasses gradual learning. It arrives whole. Texts, equations, and artifacts do not persuade. They overwrite. The Necronomicon is often misunderstood as a book of spells. In practice, it functions more like a compressed worldview. One fictional marginal note reads, "The danger is not what it commands, but what it assumes." This distinction matters. The reader is not instructed to act. They are forced to accept premises that invalidate their existing models of reality. Once those premises settle, ordinary reasoning continues inside a broken frame. Access defines the threat more than intent. Characters do not need belief, courage, or obsession. They need exposure. A graduate student translating a fragment. A scientist solving an unfamiliar equation. A dreamer reading the wrong passage before sleep. And at the Mountains of Madness, 1936, geological evidence destabilizes understanding before any living entity appears. Knowledge itself produces collapse. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror treats information as an environmental hazard. Like radiation, it harms regardless of moral stance. Protective equipment does not exist because cognition itself is the vulnerable surface. Libraries recur as dangerous spaces for this reason. They preserve structure without context. Archives collect fragments torn from their original systems. When reassembled, they form coherent but incompatible explanations. A fictional archivist warns, "Do not complete the sequence." The warning is practical, not mystical. Completion creates alignment. Partial ignorance maintains distance. This reverses traditional scholarship, where synthesis marks success. Here, synthesis destroys stability. The danger is not secrecy, but organization. Meaning emerges, and with it, irreversible displacement. Equations function similarly. Mathematics promises neutrality, yet cosmic horror treats it as a gateway. Certain formulas describe relationships that assume additional dimensions as given. Solving them does not summon anything. It recalibrates perception. The mind begins to interpret signals differently. Space bends, time loops. A character remarks, "The proof was correct. The universe was not." This sentence captures epistemic collapse precisely. The tool remains valid. The world it describes no longer matches prior expectation. Knowledge advances while relevance disintegrates. Dream transmission intensifies the risk. Information enters without conscious filtering. Symbols compress entire systems into images. Repetition replaces study. In dream reality narratives, learning occurs passively. The sleeper does not analyze, they absorb. Upon waking, memory persists without explanation. This asymmetry prevents correction. One cannot argue with what feels already known, not persuasion, but implantation. The mind accepts the structure because it lacks a record of acquisition. This makes dream-born knowledge especially corrosive. It erodes skepticism at the root. Importantly, forbidden knowledge does not destroy truth. It destroys the knower's capacity to function within human frameworks. Characters often attempt to warn others after exposure, but fail to communicate effectively. Language collapses into fragments, diagrams, or compulsive repetition. This is not censorship. It is translation failure. The knowledge remains accurate, but accuracy no longer helps. Epistemic collapse occurs when true statements cannot be used to navigate lived reality. The subject knows more, yet understands less. Ethically, this creates paralysis. Should such knowledge be destroyed, hidden, or preserved? Cosmic horror refuses to answer. Destruction does not remove structure from the universe. Preservation risks accidental exposure. Silence delays harm but guarantees repetition. Characters often choose restraint, not heroism. They lock books away, they burn notes, they withdraw. Not because the knowledge is false, but because it is too correct. This is not ignorance as virtue, but limitation as survival strategy. As this pattern repeats, the focus shifts. The question is no longer why knowledge is forbidden, but how stories can represent its effects without transmitting it fully. The next step lies in literary manifestation. How specific texts allow these dimensions to intrude indirectly, leaving readers changed without ever showing the complete truth. Early appearances of cosmic dimensions rarely announce themselves directly. Instead, they surface as absences within otherwise familiar narratives. Arthur Macon's The Great God Pan, 1894, never fully depicts the other realm it implies. It frames horror through aftermath, madness, social collapse, unexplained suicides. The dimension exists only through consequence. Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, pushes further by presenting a landscape that behaves incorrectly. Space itself resists habitation. These early texts establish a method. Dimensions are not entered, they intrude. Their narrative function is destabilization, not exploration. They create pressure on realism until realism fails quietly without spectacle. Lovecraft inherited this restraint and formalized it. His stories assume dimensions as already present, waiting for alignment. In The Call of Cthulhu, the sunken city of Relaye rises briefly, governed by geometry all wrong. The phrase matters because it replaces description with judgment. The city is not described as strange. It is described as incompatible. The scene lasts only moments before collapse. This brevity prevents familiarity. The dimension is glimpsed, not mapped. Its function within the story is confirmation. It proves that scattered clues point to a real, functioning system beyond human space. The Color Out of Space, 1927, refines this technique further. The color is not a creature, nor clearly a substance. It arrives, alters the environment, and departs. Scientists examine samples, yet language fails. One character admits the color was, only by analogy, a color at all. This line signals categorical failure. The dimension leaks through matter rather than opening a portal. Its narrative role is contamination. The landscape becomes evidence. The horror persists because the color leaves no explanation behind, only altered conditions that cannot be reversed. By contrast, the dream quest of unknown Kadath, 1927, presents sustained dimensional travel. At first, the dreamlands resemble fantasy. Familiar creatures speak, cities trade, yet coherence erodes gradually. Carter's journey lacks accumulation. Each discovery replaces rather than builds upon the last. The dimension resists narrative progress. Its function is attrition, meaning disperses through abundance. The reader senses that extended exposure dissolves identity rather than expanding it. This marks an evolution. Dimensions no longer intrude briefly. They absorb slowly without clear boundaries. Later stories tighten the connection between dimension and epistemic failure. In At the Mountains of Madness, 1936, the alien city is carefully described, yet its true horror lies in what it implies about time and biology. The elder things precede humanity entirely. One passage notes they were men before there were men. The phrasing collapses evolutionary hierarchy. The city functions as a record, not a threat. Its existence invalidates human centrality. The dimension here is historical rather than spatial. It reframes the past, making extinction feel procedural rather than tragic. Collaborative and later expansions altered these ideas unevenly. August Derleth attempted to systematize dimensions into moral categories during the 1940s, introducing opposition and balance. This clarification weakened ambiguity. By contrast, Clark Ashton Smith intensified alien logic through excess, describing realms where time pools and decay stabilizes. Modern writers such as Thomas Ligotti return to abstraction. In The Last Feast of Harlequin, 1990, the dimension remains implied through ritual, repetition rather than geography. The mythos evolves by subtraction. Less is shown, more is inferred. Across these manifestations, the function remains consistent. Dimensions are narrative solvents. They dissolve plot, character, and resolution without direct confrontation. They connect texts not through shared maps, but through shared failure. Each story adds a fragment, never a system. This evolution prepares the final question. Once these dimensions escape their original texts, how do they persist culturally and psychologically? To answer that, we must examine what happens after fiction ends, when ideas continue without containment. The color out of space occupies a pivotal position because it removes the dimension from recognizable geography without replacing it with an alternate world. The story begins as a local history, framed by an unnamed surveyor documenting land before its submersion by a reservoir. This choice matters. The narrative voice is technical, restrained, and retrospective. Nothing supernatural is expected. The intrusion occurs gradually, beginning with a meteorite that does not behave like an object. It cools, shrinks, and refuses stable classification. From the outset, the dimension enters through anomaly rather than invasion. The land remains familiar, its laws do not. The color itself resists ontological placement. Lovecraft famously writes that it was only by analogy a color at all. This sentence does more than describe strangeness. It invalidates the perceptual category used to observe it. Color implies wavelength, reflection, and spectrum. The entity conforms to none of these. Scientists in the story attempt spectroscopy and chemical testing, but results dissolve into contradiction. The narrative function is clear. Empirical method remains intact. yet its outputs no longer correspond to reality. The dimension does not oppose science. It renders scientific categories insufficient. Environmental transformation replaces spectacle. Crops grow large but tasteless. Animals behave erratically. Milk turns luminous and undrinkable. These changes are not random. They suggest systematic alteration of matter at a foundational level. The color drains vitality while increasing size, a reversal of natural growth logic. One farmer observes that the land is going queer, a vague phrase that captures experiential truth better than technical explanation. This reveals something profound. The dimension manifests through pattern distortion, not overt destruction. The horror lies in continuity. Life persists, but incorrectly. Human response follows predictable stages. At first, curiosity dominates. Ami Pierce and the scientists document changes carefully. Fear arrives later, after consistency emerges. When all samples behave the same way, doubt vanishes. Madness follows not from terror, but from recognition. The Gardner family does not panic immediately. They adapt. This adaptation proves fatal. Exposure accumulates through routine, eating crops, drinking water, remaining in place. The dimension does not require attention. It operates passively. Survival depends on leaving, yet familiarity delays that decision. The family's psychological decline mirrors environmental decay. Mrs. Gardner's breakdown is described clinically, without melodrama. Her speech deteriorates into fixation on the well. This focus is not symbolic. It is accurate. The well contains concentrated intrusion. Her madness reflects proximity, not weakness. The narrative avoids interior monologue, preserving distance. We observe effects without accessing experience. This restraint prevents identification and preserves unease. The dimension remains external, even as it reshapes minds. Not possession, but saturation. The climax avoids confrontation entirely. The color rises into the sky and departs. There is no battle, no resolution. Afterward, the land remains poisoned. The surveyor concludes that nothing will grow. There again. Importantly, no explanation follows the departure. The dimension does not retreat because it is defeated. It leaves because its conditions are complete. This ending reframes horror as procedural. Events conclude without moral accounting. The universe does not notice outcomes. The story ends with damage, not meaning. Within the larger mythos, this story establishes a crucial principle. Dimensions do not need gateways, rulers, or cults. They can intersect with reality accidentally, alter it systematically, and withdraw without acknowledgement. Later stories expand scale, but this remains foundational. The color proves that cosmic horror does not require sentient antagonists. Structure alone suffices. With this case established, we can turn to a contrasting example, one where extended travel replaces brief intrusion, and where familiarity itself becomes the primary danger. The dream quest of unknown Kadath presents a radically different dimensional strategy. Instead of brief intrusion, it offers prolonged exposure. The story follows Randolph Carter through the Dreamlands, a realm accessed through sleep rather than catastrophe. At first, the dimension appears navigable. Cities have names, roads connect regions, guides offer directions. This familiarity is deliberate. Lovecraft constructs a setting that resembles mythic fantasy, drawing from Dunsany and classical romance. The danger lies not in hostility, but in comfort. The dimension allows movement, which encourages trust. That trust becomes the primary vulnerability. Unlike earlier stories, the Dreamlands operate with internal consistency. Rules exist, but but they are unstable. Time behaves selectively. Distance collapses without warning. Carter travels widely, yet progress feels circular. One passage notes that, "The way was long, though no miles were marked. Measurement fails without announcing failure." The narrative function of this dimension is erosion. Each encounter replaces certainty with another obligation, another bargain, another detour. The journey never accumulates meaning. It disperses it. This reveals something profound. Extended dimensional exposure dissolves purpose without inducing panic. Dreamland's entities reinforce this effect. Cats, priests, and masked figures speak fluently, yet withhold clarity. Their dialogue sounds helpful, but delivers misdirection. Nyarlathotep appears not as an abstract terror, but as a messenger offering solutions. This presentation matters. The entity's intelligence is not incomprehensible. It is persuasive. Carter is not overwhelmed. He is guided incorrectly. The dimension does not break the mind through excess. It misaligns it through cooperation. Understanding feels close enough to pursue, yet never arrives intact. Identity erosion replaces madness as the central consequence. Carter remains rational throughout the journey. He plans, remembers, and reasons. What changes is scale of concern. Home fades. Desire narrows. The quest itself replaces all other reference points. Late in the narrative, it becomes clear that Carter's goal reflects a childhood memory rather than an external truth. The dimension feeds on fixation. It allows obsession to masquerade as purpose. This is not delusion. It is accurate memory elevated to existential priority. The horror lies in misweighting, not falsity. The climax redefines the dimension's function entirely. When Carter reaches Kadath, the revelation is not monstrous. It is explanatory. The gods he seeks have abandoned the city, and the dream he pursues already exists within him. The dimension reveals that the journey was unnecessary, yet this knowledge does not restore balance. It exhausts it. The insight arrives too late to undo dispersion. Carter survives, but returns diminished. The dimension does not punish. It consumes attention until nothing else remains. Narratively, the dreamlands operate as a slow solvent. They absorb narrative energy without escalating. Stakes. Unlike the color out of space, which contaminates locally and departs, this dimension persists through invitation. It offers continuity without accumulation. The reader experiences length without progression. This technique mirrors the thematic claim. Some dimensions do not harm through violence or anomaly, but through endless accessibility. They are always open. Leaving becomes the only danger. Within the larger mythos, this story complicates cosmic horror's reputation for sudden collapse. It demonstrates that extended contact can be more damaging than brief exposure. Madness is replaced by attrition. Terror gives way to drift. The Dreamlands prove that a dimension does not need to reject human presence to be lethal. Accommodation alone is sufficient. With this case established, we can now examine how later writers expanded, systematized, or resisted these ideas, often by misunderstanding the very ambiguity that made them endure. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, the Bahichi dimensional framework he left behind became contested territory. August Derleth approached the material as something to be organized rather than preserved in tension. During the 1940s, he introduced elemental alignments, oppositional forces, and moral balance. Dimensions became battlegrounds. Entities gained roles resembling good and evil. This shift altered narrative function. Ambiguity gave way to hierarchy. fear narrowed into conflict. Derleth's impulse was archival, not philosophical. He sought coherence. In doing so, he treated dimensions as places within a system, rather than conditions that undermine systems themselves. The result was accessibility at the cost of unease. Clark Ashton Smith moved in the opposite direction. His expansions intensified alien logic instead of clarifying it. Stories such as The Dark Eidolon and The Abominations of Yondo depict realms where time stagnates and decay stabilizes into permanence. One passage describes a city older than its own, ruins. This formulation resists chronology. Smith's dimensions are excessive, baroque, and terminal. They do not invite exploration. They overwhelm it. Narrative function shifts from implication to saturation. The reader is not guided. They are buried. This approach preserves cosmic indifference while amplifying sensory density, demonstrating that expansion need not reduce ambiguity. Later contributors varied widely. Some attempted to map dimensions explicitly, naming coordinates and rules. These efforts often collapsed tension by implying mastery. Others, particularly in the late 20th century, returned to abstraction. Ramsey Campbell localized dimensions psychologically, embedding them in urban spaces that felt subtly misaligned. Thomas Ligotti stripped them of geography entirely. In The Red Tower, 1996, the dimension exists as a conceptual structure, an edifice that grows through repetition and cannot be placed in space. The story reads like a report without subject. This reveals something profound. Dimensions no longer require scale. They require pattern. Modern expansions increasingly resist continuity. Writers abandon shared maps while preserving shared failure. The mythos survives through thematic alignment rather than lore. Time loops, recursive structures, and informational hazards replace named entities. Compare this to earlier pulp expansions that emphasize genealogy and taxonomy. The newer approach treats dimension as effect rather than setting. Readers encounter outcomes without origin. This restores the original unsettling quality. Coherence exists, but explanation remains absent. The dimension feels real because it behaves consistently, not because it is defined. Interactive media further complicates expansion. Games and digital narratives allow prolonged exposure to hostile environments. Yet the most effective adaptations avoid explanation. Levels repeat. Geometry distorts. Objectives dissolve. The player experiences systems without narrative reward. This mirrors the philosophical core more accurately than direct adaptation. The dimension is not something to defeat. It is something to endure briefly before withdrawal becomes necessary. Survival depends on disengagement. Victory remains undefined. Across these collaborations and expansions, a pattern emerges. Attempts to clarify dimensions reduce their impact. Attempts to intensify implication preserve it. The mythos evolves by resisting closure, not expansion through addition, but endurance through restraint. Each successful contribution understands that cosmic dimensions lose power when treated as destinations. They regain it when treated as structural threats to meaning itself. This evolution carries consequences beyond literature. Once dimensions are understood as conceptual rather than spatial, they no longer remain confined to stories. They migrate into cultural anxiety, digital folklore, and psychological language. The question shifts again. What happens when these ideas detach from their texts and circulate independently? To answer that, we must examine their afterlife, where cosmic dimensions persist long after the page ends. Cosmic dimensions did not remain confined to 20th century fiction. They migrated because they addressed a problem modern culture could not resolve: the fear that reality functions independently of meaning. Urban legends about impossible rooms, missing staircases, and buildings with shifting interiors repeat the same structure. These stories rarely include monsters. Instead, they describe environments that behave incorrectly. Online folklore, such as the Backrooms, presents endless corridors without origin or exit. The horror comes from continuity without purpose. These spaces persist because they mirror lived experience in large systems, bureaucratic, digital, architectural, where navigation exists but resolution does not. Digital culture accelerated this spread. Internet forums, image boards, and liminal photography turned abstraction into shared imagery. Empty malls, vacant offices, and fluorescent hallways evoke dimensional wrongness without narrative explanation. These images feel unsettling because they suggest use without users. The environment remains intact after intention disappears. Games such as Control and Antichamber formalize this effect through mechanics. Space reconfigures itself logically, yet unpredictably. Players learn rules that change contextually. Mastery remains temporary. This design echoes cosmic horror's central claim: systems can be internally consistent while remaining hostile to comprehension. Music and sound art also reflect this shift. Ambient and drone compositions abandon melody in favor of texture and repetition. Time stretches without progression. Listening becomes endurance rather than pleasure. This mirrors the function of dream reality dimensions, where exposure replaces event. The listener is not attacked, they are absorbed. Visual art follows a similar path. Installations emphasize scale, emptiness, and recursion. The viewer encounters structure without instruction. Meaning is not hidden, it is absent. This absence does not resolve. It lingers, inviting projection without confirmation. Academic discourse has responded cautiously. Philosophers and theorists reference cosmic horror when discussing anthropocentrism, object-oriented ontology, and limits of cognition. The appeal lies in its refusal to privilege human access. Reality does not need observers to validate it. This position unsettles disciplines built on interpretation. Psychology encounters similar resistance. Liminal spaces and derealization are studied, yet explanations remain incomplete. The experience persists despite classification. Cosmic dimensions offer a language for these gaps without claiming authority. They describe effect rather than cause. Subcultures adopt these ideas because they articulate diffuse anxiety without prescribing response. Unlike apocalyptic narratives, cosmic dimensions do not demand action. There is no enemy to defeat, no future to secure. This neutrality resonates in periods of environmental uncertainty and technological acceleration. Systems grow larger. Individuals feel smaller. The dimension becomes a metaphor that does not simplify. It holds complexity without resolving it. This reveals something profound. People return to cosmic horror not for fear, but for accuracy. It matches the emotional texture of modern life without offering false solutions. Importantly, these dimensions persist because they resist closure. They do not end with revelation or catastrophe. They continue. Stories conclude, but the structures remain implied. This open-endedness allows constant reinterpretation. Each generation projects its own anxieties onto the same framework. Industrialization once filled these spaces. Digital abstraction fills them now. The dimension adapts because it never specifies content. It defines relationship. Human cognition encountering systems that do not adjust in return. At a universal level, these ideas confront a basic question. Is meaning intrinsic or applied locally for survival? Cosmic dimensions suggest the latter. Meaning works, but only within narrow ranges. Outside those ranges, systems persist without reference to value. This implication unsettles because it cannot be disproven. It also cannot be fully accepted without consequence. The ideas endure because they remain unresolved. They do not ask to be believed. They ask to be considered briefly before one looks away and continues living as if the structure still holds. Film has always struggled with cosmic dimensions because cinema depends on visibility. The most effective adaptations, therefore, rely on absence rather than display. Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, 1979, presents the zone as a space governed by rules that are never explained and never stable. Nothing monstrous appears. Instead, paths rearrange themselves and intention becomes dangerous. The zone functions as a dimensional condition, not a location. Similarly, Annihilation, 2018, visualizes intrusion through refracted landscapes and altered biology, but withholds origin. The shimmer is not an enemy. It is a process. These films succeed by treating dimensions as filters applied to reality, not alternate worlds entered through spectacle. Games prove more compatible with dimensional horror because they operate through systems rather than images. Antechamber, 2013, teaches players rules that contradict spatial intuition. Hallways loop. Perspective alters outcome. Mastery requires abandoning expectation. The dimension is learned, then unlearned. Control, 2019, extends this approach. The oldest house appears bureaucratic and navigable, yet rearranges itself without warning. Documents describe phenomena without explaining them. Gameplay mirrors epistemic collapse. Understanding increases, but certainty does not. This reveals something profound. Interactivity allows players to experience incompatibility directly, not as narrative, but as constraint. Sound design deepens this effect. In Silent Hill 2, 2001, industrial drones and dissonant loops replace melody. Music does not signal emotion. It signals environment. The listener remains suspended in unresolved tension. Ambient artists such as Lustmord explicitly draw from cosmic horror, describing their work as architecture for the void. Tracks unfold without progression, denying climax. Time stretches. Listening becomes exposure. This mirrors dream reality dimensions, where duration replaces event. The soundscape does not frighten. It destabilizes orientation. Silence, repetition, and low-frequency resonance imply scale beyond comprehension. Visual media outside narrative also participate. Experimental films and video art emphasize empty interiors and recursive motion. Endless stairwells. Elevators that never arrive. Surveillance footage without subjects. These images circulate widely online because they require no context. The dimension is implied by behavior, not story. Architecture becomes uncanny when it persists without use. This aesthetic aligns with cosmic horror's core claim. Systems do not require observers. The viewer recognizes structure without purpose. That recognition produces unease without instruction. Meaning is not hidden. It is simply not present. Music videos and album art increasingly adopt this logic. Abstract geometry, distorted bodies, and looping motion replace symbolic storytelling. The imagery suggests rules without revealing them. One electronic artist describes their work as soundtrack for spaces that do not care. This framing avoids narrative entirely. The dimension is affective rather than representational. It produces a mood of endurance. consumption becomes participation. The audience does not decode meaning. They acclimate briefly to an environment that refuses interpretation. Across these media, a consistent pattern emerges. Adaptations fail when they explain too much. They succeed when they preserve structural indifference. Cosmic dimensions endure in modern culture because they translate easily into systems, game mechanics, sound loops, architectural logic, without requiring belief. They do not demand immersion, they impose conditions. The viewer, player, or listener adapts temporarily, then exits unchanged on the surface, but unsettled underneath. The implication remains open. If such dimensions can be simulated so easily, perhaps they are not exotic at all, only exaggerated versions of structures we already inhabit and rarely question. Cosmic dimensions entered academic language cautiously, often as metaphor rather than subject. Philosophers engaging with object-oriented ontology and speculative realism adopted its imagery to challenge human-centered assumptions. Thinkers like Quentin Meillassoux questioned whether reality requires observers at all, echoing cosmic horror's core premise without invoking fiction directly. The appeal lies in shared limits. Both reject the idea that human cognition anchors existence. In this context, dimensions become conceptual tools, ways to discuss systems that operate independently of interpretation. The horror remains implicit. It emerges when theory refuses reassurance. Academic use does not neutralize the idea. It formalizes unease under disciplined language. Architecture and urban studies provide another point of appropriation. Scholars analyze liminal spaces, corridors, waiting rooms, transit hubs, as environments that suspend identity and intention. These spaces function efficiently while discouraging presence. Marc Auger's concept of non-places, introduced in 1992, aligns closely with cosmic dimensional logic. Such spaces are real, navigable, and purposeless at a human scale. They do not harm occupants. They erase context. This resemblance explains why cosmic horror resonates in discussions of modern infrastructure. The dimension becomes a way to describe environments that feel complete yet indifferent to those inside them. Psychology engages these ideas through depersonalization and derealization studies. Patients report feeling displaced from reality without hallucination or delusion. The world appears intact, but meaning thins. Clinicians describe this as perceptual estrangement rather than psychosis. Cosmic dimensions offer a narrative parallel. The subject remains rational while the environment loses relevance. This framing avoids moral judgment. It treats the experience as mismatch, not failure. Importantly, treatment focuses on reintegration, not explanation. Understanding the condition does not resolve it. The persistence mirrors cosmic horror's refusal to restore coherence through insight alone. Subcultures adopt cosmic dimensions more freely, often stripping them of literary origin. Online communities share images of endless offices, stairwells, without endpoints, and simulated spaces that repeat imperfectly. These are not stories, they are artifacts. Commentary remains minimal. The implication is enough. Participants rarely seek explanation. They circulate the images because they feel accurate. This reveals something profound. Cosmic dimensions function as shared shorthand for inexpressible discomfort. They bypass narrative and analysis. Recognition replaces interpretation. The dimension persists because it does not require belief, only resonance. Academic resistance also appears. Some scholars argue that cosmic horror aestheticizes despair or encourages passivity. This criticism misunderstands its function. Cosmic dimensions do not instruct resignation. They remove false agency. By doing so, they expose where agency actually operates, locally, temporarily, and under constraint. This distinction matters, not helplessness, but scale awareness. In environmental humanities, similar logic appears when discussing climate, systems. Individual action matters, yet does not control outcomes. The system continues. Cosmic dimensions provide a language for this imbalance without reducing it to moral failure. Art theory increasingly references these structures when discussing abstraction and repetition. Installations that emphasize scale, recursion, or emptiness resist interpretation by design. Viewers encounter form without narrative anchor. The experience is not symbolic, it is procedural. One critic describes such work as encounter without message. This aligns precisely with cosmic horror's dimensional logic. Meaning is not hidden behind the work. It is unnecessary to the work's function. The audience supplies context briefly, then recognizes its irrelevance. That recognition produces discomfort without spectacle. Across these appropriations, the dimension survives because it remains unresolved. Disciplines borrow its structure, not its mythology. They use it to name gaps where explanation fails, but experience persists. The idea travels because it adapts without collapsing. It resists closure even under analysis. This persistence suggests a deeper utility. Cosmic dimensions offer a way to think about systems too large, too abstract, or too indifferent to integrate comfortably. They do not solve these problems, they mark them. And by marking them without explanation, they remain available for reuse, reinterpretation, and quiet return whenever certainty begins to feel excessive again. Cosmic dimensions endure because they articulate a fear that cannot be resolved through explanation. They suggest that reality does not oppose human meaning, it ignores it. This idea unsettles because it removes drama from existence. There is no antagonist to confront, no revelation to survive. The dimension persists whether acknowledged or not. Philosophically, this challenges traditions that assume understanding leads to mastery. Here, understanding exposes limits without offering leverage. Knowledge increases awareness of constraint, not freedom. This inversion lingers because it contradicts educational instinct. We expect clarity to stabilize. Cosmic dimensions demonstrate the opposite. Psychologically, these ideas resonate with experiences of scale mismatch. Individuals navigate systems, economic, technological, environmental, that exceed personal influence. The systems function efficiently, yet remain opaque. Cosmic dimensions mirror this structure precisely. They are not chaotic, they are operational. The unease comes from recognizing that functionality does not imply care. Consider this carefully. The most disturbing implication is not that we are small, but that smallness is irrelevant. The universe does not require acknowledgement to proceed. This realization produces anxiety without object, a discomfort that cannot be targeted or discharged. Time plays a critical role in this persistence. Cosmic dimensions often operate outside linear progression. They loop, stagnate, or extend indefinitely. This destabilizes narratives built on progress and resolution. Human psychology depends on sequence: beginning, development, end. Dimensions that deny sequence deny closure. This creates lingering tension even after exposure ends. The idea does not conclude, it waits. Like unfinished music, it occupies cognitive space without resolving. This explains why cosmic horror ideas return unexpectedly, long after the initial encounter. They are not remembered as stories, they are remembered as conditions. Ethically, cosmic dimensions complicate responsibility. If systems exceed comprehension, what does accountability mean? Traditional moral frameworks assume agency proportional to understanding. Cosmic horror suggests agency exists within constraint, not beyond it. Actions matter locally, yet fail to influence structure. This does not excuse harm. It reframes expectation. One can act without expecting consequence at scale. This tension remains unresolved because it mirrors lived reality. Environmental collapse, technological acceleration, and global networks all operate beyond individual control. Cosmic dimensions give shape to this imbalance without simplifying it. Importantly, these ideas do not demand belief. They do not ask to replace worldview. They coexist quietly alongside ordinary assumptions. One can function normally while holding the possibility that reality is provisional. This compartmentalization allows the idea to persist without dominating thought. The dimension remains latent, surfacing during moments of disorientation, insomnia, isolation, abstraction. It does not announce itself. It waits for alignment between concept and circumstance. The most enduring implication lies here. Cosmic dimensions suggest that meaning is not guaranteed, but constructed temporarily for survival. This does not negate value. It localizes it. Meaning works where it is applied. Outside those bounds, systems continue untouched. This realization does not instruct despair. It removes false comfort. Whether this clarity is tolerable remains an open question. Cosmic horror offers no final statement. It leaves the listener with a possibility rather than a conclusion. The dimensions remain hypothetical, yet disturbingly plausible. They do not close. They recede. And once encountered, even indirectly, they alter how absence, structure, and silence are perceived. The ideas do not demand attention. They wait, unchanged, for the next moment when certainty begins to feel too narrow to trust.